So how can we work around that problem? This is such a common problem and such a common scenario that React has a solution for it. There is another hook which we can import from React, and that's the useEffect hook. useEffect is a hook that allows you to run some code under certain conditions. At the moment, this code for sending the request runs always when the component function runs. With useEffect, we'll be able to restrict this and define conditions when this code should run, so that it does not always run. For this, we call useEffect. We execute this useEffect function directly in our component function. And then useEffect wants two arguments. The first argument is a function. And here I will pass in an anonymous arrow function. The second argument is an array of dependencies. And I'll come back to this array in a second. Now, inside of this first argument, inside of this function, we can execute our fetch code here. So I'll cut this and add this into this effect function. Now, this effect function, this first argument here, which we pass to useEffect, will be executed by React on our behalf, but only under certain circumstances, not always when this component reruns. I'll come back to those circumstances in a second. Now, with that, we make sure that our fetch request here, our fetch function, is only executed when React executes this function. Now, when does React execute this function though? If we would not specify this second argument, this array, if we would omit this, then this effect function would execute whenever this component function executes. So then we don't gain anything. That's why you need this second argument. You technically don't need it, it's not required, but if you omit it, there is no difference compared to just running the code in the component function. With this second argument added though, React will check the values you add to this array and compare them to their equivalents when this effect function was executed the last time. Now, if that's an empty array, there are no dependencies. And then React will only execute this function when this component function rendered and executed for the first time. And for subsequent executions of this component function, this effect function will not run because we have no dependencies. So the values of the dependencies are always the same because there are no values. Now, if you would add a dependency here, like let's say the isLoadingStateSnapshot, which you should not, but if we would have this as a dependency here, then this function would execute whenever the value of isLoading changed. So if that value does not change, if that always stays the same, then this would also not execute again. But if isLoading was false, and then you somewhere update its state to true, then the value of isLoading would have changed, and then this effect function would execute again. Now, in reality, you don't need to think which values should trigger your effect function. Instead, there is a simple rule. In your dependencies array, you should add all external values your effect function relies on. So in this case, there are no external values. The fetch function is a built-in browser function. It's not one of our component props or state. And other than that, we don't use any state or prop values in this effect function that would belong to our component. If we would extract some data from props here though, if we would, for example, get the URL from props URL, let's say, then props would be a dependency and we should add props here. But that's not the case here, but that is how it would work then. setIsLoading and setLoaded meetups actually technically would be external dependencies because these are constants defined outside of this effect function, but these state updating functions are an exception. You can add them here, and that would not be incorrect, that these functions are external dependencies, and whenever these functions change, this effect should run again, because then these functions might do different things than they did the last time they were executed. But React actually guarantees that these state updating functions will never change. They will always do exactly the same thing. And therefore it's allowed to omit these functions here. And hence, in our scenario here, we use useEffect like this, with an empty dependencies array, since we have no external dependencies here, and therefore this code will only run once when this component is rendered for the first time. Now I dive way deeper into useEffect with more examples and also more features of this hook in my course, but what you learned here is the core foundation of useEffect, which you have to understand. That you can use it for running such side effects, as they are called, code which does not directly influence what's showing up on the screen, and that for such side effects, useEffect is the proper solution for controlling when this code should run. Now with that, we actually should also set isLoading to true here at the beginning of this effect function, so that whenever this effect would run again, we set this to true again. It doesn't run again here, but still, that is cleaner, I would argue. And then we send this request, and ultimately we update our loading state again, and we set our loaded meetups to the data we fetched here. And now with that, it still won't work, because setting the data like this is incorrect, as it turns out, but we don't have an infinite loop. And I hope I could make it clear why that's the case. If we now save everything, our app crashes, because as I said, we're setting the wrong data, but we don't have an infinite loop. So now what's wrong with that data though? The problem with our data is that when we fetch meetups from Firebase, we actually don't get an array. Instead, we get an object where these cryptic auto-generated IDs act as properties. So when we send a GET request to our Firebase API, we get back an object with two properties in this case, and these here are our property names, and then nested inside of these properties, we got nested objects with the actual meetup data. Now, here in our component though, we expect an array, because in meetup list, we map on our data, and that only exists on an array, not on our object. Hence, we need to transform the data here in all meetups before we set our state. Once we fetched the data, so in this second then block here, we want to transform the data. And we can do this for creating a helper array here, meetups like this, and then a for in loop where we go through all our keys in data, so all the keys in this data object we fetched from Firebase. And these keys will be these random IDs here, these unique IDs, that will be our keys. And then we create a new meetup here for every key through which we loop. So for every meetup that's stored on Firebase. And we can set the ID equal to key, since that is that auto-generated ID. And then just distribute data key into this object. So we access the nested object for the given key. So we access the nested object here. And then we just use the spread operator, which is a default JavaScript operator, to copy all the key value pairs of this nested object into this object. And that constructs a meetup object as we need it. And then we just need to push that onto our helper array here. And then it's this helper meetups array, which we want to set as our loaded meetups data. And now if we do that, if we transform the data like this, if we save this and reload, we see loading briefly, but then we see all our meetups. And that's how we can fetch data, in this case from Firebase, but in general with useEffect fetching data with a loading and a data state without causing an infinite loop.